because not only do we have adverse selection on the supply side, as you discussed in some of your other podcasts, but we also now find that on the demand side, consumers have a really hard time telling apart what a low impact offset from a high impact one. And so this is a concerning pattern because it suggests that it gives even more incentives for firms to greenwash and to just offer something that looks good, but that doesn't really have much impact. And so I think we need to think hard about solutions to help consumers make better decisions.
Hi, welcome to another episode of the Climate Economics Podcast with me, your host, Arvid Vian. And sometimes I discover a paper and I'm really intrigued by its results. And the paper we are going to discuss today is one of those. The paper is called Willingness to Pay for Carbon Mitigation, Field Evidence from the Market for Carbon Offsets. Now, on this podcast, we have already tackled carbon offsets in 2 other episodes, namely episode 4 with Ben Probst and episode 17 with Beatriz Granziera. But that was kind of more on the supply side of carbon offsets. Whereas this paper covers the demand angle, as it analyzes how much we are willing to pay for carbon mitigation. And not just how much people say they are willing to pay, but what people are actually willing to pay. And that is an important difference, as we will see. In addition, we are going to discuss several factors that can influence this willingness to pay, as well as the great experiment underlying all of these results. And to discuss this paper, I'm delighted to have the papers author with me today. And so it's Matthias Rodemeier, who is an assistant professor of finance at Bocconi University. And his research lies at the union of behavioral economics and public finance. And his work brings behavioral insights to environmental policy, taxation, and household finance. And many of his studies use field experiments in collaboration with private and public organizations. So Matthias, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I'm very excited because I was very intrigued when I saw your paper. And maybe just to start then, what is the number one thing you would want people to take away from your paper?
Yeah, so the paper looks at this market for voluntary carbon mitigation in the context of a field experiment with an online supermarket, a large online supermarket in Germany, and looks at what happens when the supermarket gives consumers the possibility to compensate the emissions of their delivery. And we randomize various things in this online supermarket. And what we find is that when the offset becomes cheaper to consumers, they buy more, which is sort of intuitive, or they're more likely to buy this offset. But when it becomes more impactful, and what I mean by that is when it mitigates more emissions, nothing happens to demand. So people are fully impact inelastic, we would say in economics. They don't respond to the impact of the offset at all. And we then look at the mechanisms of why this is the case and how this can be mitigated in the context of this field experiment. And then maybe the final thing I should say as a key takeaway is that firm participation in this market really matters. So if the firm tells consumers that they are sharing part of the costs of this offset, then people become more willing to buy this offset. But they also become more impact elastic. So they suddenly start responding to the amount of emissions that this offset actually compensates.
Thank you for that. And let's then dive into some of those because the price elasticity versus the impact inelastic result is. So, as I understand, when prices go down, you would just buy more of these. But like if you keep the price constant, you just produce more CO2, then nothing happens. Is that a correct summary?
So let me take a step back to tell you what the setting of this online shop experiment actually is. We integrated into the checkout page of this online shop the possibility to offset the carbon emissions of a typical delivery. And this offset would consist of 2 main attributes. One is the price. It could cost 20 cents, it could cost 40 cents, or 60 cents, or €1. And the other attribute is how much carbon it actually compensates. And that could be 2 kilos, it could be 4 kilos, it could be 8 kilos. And we would randomize that as well. And so what we see is that this variation in what I call impact, how much this offset actually compensates, does absolutely nothing to demand. So people just buy as much if the offset compensates 8 kilogram or if it compensates 2 kilogram, which is a pretty striking result because the market analog would be, if I sell you one Snickers or if I sell you four Snickers bars, it doesn't change your willingness to pay it off, right? So you
Yeah.
really seem to struggle to understand what you're buying, or you don't care. One of those two things.
Which then leads you, I think, to say that people buy this also for other reasons than the mitigation.
Yeah, so the classical interpretation of this, what in environmental economics is called scope and sensitivity, goes back to a very early paper by Kahneman and Knetsch, uh, is that people have warm glow when they do something good. Also, I guess the correct citation here is also Andreoni. And so what that means is that you do something good, but you don't really care about how good that is. You don't really care about the impact of it. You just mostly do it to feel good about yourself. And that's the classic interpretation of this type of scope and sensitivity. And we then explore whether that is actually really the reason or whether it has something to do with other features.
And then, because that is kind of supporting this warm glow, the still price inelastic, as I understood it, or not.
So with warm glow, you still price elastic, meaning, when doing something good gets cheaper, you're more likely to do it.
Yeah.
But if it becomes more impactful, if it helps the world more and more, you really don't care about that. You just do it to get this warm glow in your belly, and that's the reason why you do it in the first place.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. You buy more because you can get more of the warm feeling, but like the impact itself doesn't matter. I think that's a nice explanation. And then one thing then you also looked at. So this is kind of the result, but then you did try to differentiate the intrinsic value from the warm glow effect.
Exactly. So one feature of this experiment is that we don't just randomize the quantity, the impact, these kilograms of CO2 between subjects, so across people, but also within subject. So the same person sees multiple or sees different kilograms of CO2 every time she visits the website. So she, over time, as she visits several times, she will be exposed to different levels of impact. And so that helps her potentially learn about this attribute, kilograms of carbon, because that might be something that is really hard for us to evaluate, right? What do we know what 2 kilograms of CO2 mean or 4 kilograms of CO2? That's just something that most of us would struggle with. But if we see over time different levels of impact, at least we know, yesterday I looked at the website, it was 2 kilograms of CO2. Today I'm getting a product that is 4 kilograms. So that's at least twice as much as I saw yesterday. And so maybe now I'm more willing to buy. Now that would tell me this is really not warm glow. You just have a hard time understanding this product. And once you gather experience with it, you start valuing it more, and that is something that we see.
And then what are your results then? Is because your experiment is based on euro cents per kilo, but then you do transform your results to the more standard euro per ton of CO2. So could you talk about the magnitudes that you find?
Yeah. So the first thing is if we were to just look between subjects, so in this result that people don't respond to, we get this result that people don't respond to impact. Um, then you would estimate that people buy carbon offsets, but their willingness to pay for the carbon it actually mitigates is zero. So this would get you this conclusion: willingness to pay is zero. People just buy the carbon offset because they feel good. But if you once you allow for learning, these repeated interactions with these offsets, you actually see that people start being more likely to purchase the product when it has higher impact. And then we estimate a value of anywhere between 13 to 16 euros per ton of CO2, which is still very far from what we think the social cost of carbon is. So clearly, these markets do not, even once people have learned, do not fully internalize the externality from carbon emissions. But this number tells us how far we are away. This private market is away from the social cost of carbon estimate.
Yeah, exactly. If you, for reference, the EU ETS is like 60 to 70 euros, and then estimates have gone as high as, much higher to like the $180 I think you cite. But actually, one thing I took away, which I didn't fully get yet, is that it's because of the learning that initially they started, if I rephrase it, initially they buy it to get to warm glow, but then over time they learn more, and then actually they start buying it for the reductions as they get more like a sense of the reductions.
Yeah, so they might still buy it for the warm glow. So that doesn't necessarily change over time. That might still be a reason for that increases their willingness to buy this product. But as they learn about the impact levels, as they get a bit of a sense of these magnitudes, they also start valuing the impact itself, and now start choosing offset products that are more powerful in reducing emissions.
So, because then the intrinsic, I think you said like is like 13 to 16 euro.
Yeah, yeah. The
Um,
intrinsic one is
yeah,
really just 13
yeah,
per ton of CO2. Exactly, yeah.
yeah. And then did you estimate like the warm glow in tons of euro per ton of CO2?
So yeah, so if you were to if you wanted to decompose everything into euros, you would get 13 euros per ton of CO2 is the intrinsic willingness to pay. Then it's around a warm glow is around €1. And then if the firm chips in and says, "Hey, we also are willing to, share the costs with you," then willingness to pay increases by another €2. So then you are at 16 euros per ton of CO2 is sort of the highest value that we can estimate in the study, which would be adding up intrinsic preferences, warm glow, and sort of the social preference that you have for the firm to also chip in. Uh, and then
Yeah.
you get to 16 euros per ton of CO2.
So then, if I understand it, if you were to start the experiment, someone might only be willing to pay 1 to 3 euro, but then over time, as they get repeated exposure, it might go up to 16 euro.
If the impact of the offset gets larger, yeah, it
Yeah.
might also go down, right? If they first see a very high impactful offset, but then they see one that is, only compensates half the emissions that the one they saw yesterday did, it could also go down. Yeah.
Okay. So then I think that also brings us to the role of firms, because you basically looked at how firms can increase contributions. You looked at, I think, both the subsidies and like giving price subsidies for consumers as well as matching. So could you talk about more about the role of firms in this experiment?
So what we randomized in the study was whether the firm would tell the consumer that they pay a certain percentage of the offset cost. So this could look like, you can buy this offset for, it costs normally 40 cents, but we, the firm, are now willing to chip in 50%. So now you only have to pay 20 cents, right? That would be what we call a subsidy in the paper, a subsidy by the firm. And then alternatively, you could also say the firm is not making it cheaper for the consumer, but they are increasing the amount of carbon that the offset or that the choice of the consumer now mitigates. So let's say you can buy a carbon offset that compensates 2 kilograms. Then the firm says, "Hey, if you do that, we will compensate another 2 kilograms, and we will finance that through our own costs." And so that's what we call a match. And so we see how these subsidies and matches compare to each other in determining consumer demand and in terms of cost effectiveness. And what we find there is that matches are much more cost effective than subsidies. And what I mean by that, by cost effectiveness, is if you are a firm and you think about where should I put my next euro into, should I put it into offering a subsidy to the consumer, or should I offer them a match with that euro, then you really want to go for the match. And the reason is that the carbon offsets are not super price elastic. They are price elastic, but not terribly price elastic. And with a subsidy, the additional amount of carbon that is mitigated really only comes from marginal consumers. So you reduce the price, and now how much more carbon mitigation do you get? Well, only through those that now purchase and that otherwise would have not purchased, right? And so, in other words, incremental mitigation only comes from marginal consumers. But with matches, that's not the case. If you now say to all consumers, we will double the amount of carbon that this offset mitigates by through this match, then you will not just have the marginal consumers mitigate more, but also the inframarginal consumers, everybody who would have purchased anyways, because now every offset becomes twice as effective as before. And that makes matches really so much more cost effective than subsidies.
I think one thing I take away is that the matching isn't exactly then just much better because the subsidy, like not many more people are tuning in. You just get a lot bigger
Exactly,
result with the
because you're
matching.
now making offsets more impactful for everybody, also those that don't respond at all to this intervention.
So we covered the firms. I think maybe then I would like to go back to the consumers. So we said about the intrinsic value is about 13 euro per ton of CO2. However, another part of your paper is that you then contacted people to ask what are you willing to pay so people can state their preferences. And could you talk about what you did there and the results you
Yeah,
found?
so the reason we did that was because there is this huge literature in environmental economics that studies people's willingness to pay for environmental goods or directly for carbon mitigation through surveys. And there's literature that I have a textbook here on my desk that is a it's a huge book that is called Valuing Environmental Preferences, and it's just coming from contingent valuation studies, which are these studies that use surveys asking people for their hypothetical willingness to pay. Now, why did environmental economists use these data preferences for such a long time, even though economists are typically pretty obsessed with getting revealed preferences? Because there was simply no way of incentivizing these questions. There was no way of saying, before the market for carbon offsets, there was no way of saying, how much are you willing to pay for 10 kilograms of CO2, and making this a consequential choice. And now this market for carbon offsets is sort of gives us the first opportunity to look at incentivized choices and get revealed preference estimates of people's willingness to pay for carbon mitigation. And so that's what we do in the field experiment. But then we would also like to know if we had gotten the same results or different results if we just stick with the old school way of doing things and running a survey and just asking people. And so what we did in the experiment is, after the field experiment, we reached out to some of the consumers through the firm and invited them to a survey. So now they knew they were being part of a research study, as is the case in the literature as well. And then we just asked them, we offered them basically hypothetical cases with these, where they could also buy carbon offsets. And we would say, what would you be willing to pay for this carbon offset? And then you get numbers that are really an order of magnitude, more than an order of magnitude larger than what people's choices suggest. So the willingness to pay for carbon mitigation of the average participant in this survey would be above 200 euros per ton of CO2, whereas their choices suggested something around 13 euros per ton of CO2. And so I think that tells us the value of taking these things to the field, because what we ultimately care about, at least typically as an economist, is what choices reveal, and that's really different from what people say.
Yeah, people's stated willingness almost gets closer to like the recent high estimates of $180, even in the Nature study. But when I read that, I'm like, that's a very big difference. Do you have a sense of, I don't know if there's like literature about this, like this sense of why this shift, or let me try that again, why this order of magnitude is there between their stated and the revealed preferences?
Yeah, so maybe the first thing I should say is that this difference is not explained by people thinking about um, maybe environmental policy, right? You could think that if you ask people hypothetically, what are you willing to pay? They might think of a carbon tax or of these policy tools that would force everybody to reduce their emissions and therefore be something much more effective than this voluntary market for carbon mitigation. So your first response might be, well, the reason you get two different results is just when you survey people, they think of something else. And so that was something we were worried about when we designed the survey. And that's why we really asked people to state the willingness to pay for the same carbon offset, not for some policy, for the same carbon offset that we also used in the experiment, in the field experiment. And so we really get this apples to apples comparison. And then the question is, so why is this difference now that we know it's comparable? Why is it so large? And there I can, to some extent, only speculate. I mean, it is very consistent with a big literature in environmental economics. Also, John List has some work on this, on hypothetical bias. So people tend to overstate their generosity generally in surveys relative to what they end up doing. Economists also like to say talk is cheap, and that's one reason why they care so much about revealed preferences. There are things around, they're called social desirability bias. So there's evidence that people also like to make a good impression in a survey, and so they tell you something that differs largely from what they would do in private choices. And then I think it's also that it's just hard to predict what you would do in market environment. If you tell me what's my willingness to pay for something, I could imagine that even without trying to lie to you or trying to feel good about myself, I might mispredict that just because it's hard to know what I would do once I'm in that situation.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's actually a very good point that if you're just like, I'm now in this field, like I know about the social cost of carbon, but if you don't know about it and you ask the willingness to pay, then it's like, okay, what is the reference? So your paper is the first paper to use like a field experiment to estimate the demand for voluntary carbon mitigation. So how did you get the company on board? Because I don't really, like your experiment. You've reached over 250,000 consumers. How did you go setting up this experiment?
Yeah, so I've been running field experiments with firms for quite a long time. I started doing this with my at the outset of my PhD, and I was always surprised. At least at the beginning, I was surprised how long these things take. So it can sometimes take years from the point of contact with a firm until you actually run the experiment. Here, it was actually not so hard. It was quite efficient because this firm was very open for testing these type of strategies, in part because they are part of an industry that is booming at the moment, which is delivering things to your door, right? Whether it's Amazon, whether it's groceries to your door, fast food to your door, everything comes to your door now. And of course, that produces some emissions that consumers might worry about, especially in European cities. The alternative is oftentimes to actually walk to the supermarket or take a bike. And so it was somewhat natural for these and this particular firm to think about carbon offsetting and other mitigation strategies. And um, I think the way we started, I saw these trucks driving around in my city everywhere, and at some point I picked up the phone and I tried to figure out who the CEO of the company was and talked to him about why they're not offering carbon offsets and whether that could be something we could do together. And they were very excited.
Awesome. That's the entrepreneurial mindset, which I feel like you need for field experiments. You need kind of this entrepreneurial mindset to to get it off the ground. Because and then as I read it, so you did the experiment in 2020. Then you just got it published. So congratulations on that. Um,
Takes a long
uh,
time.
takes a long time since
Yeah,
the experiment to only five
yeah.
years.
Welcome to academia.
Exactly. So, which then makes me wonder, like, have you done further things in this field? Like, has there been additional like results of working papers or things building on this? Like, where do you see this going in terms of further research?
Yeah, so I have been talking with various firms on to study further the market of carbon offsets. I'm also partnering with a firm that installs cook stoves in Tanzania and tracks the emissions through some digital trackers, and we're about to run field experiments there as well. I'm in talk with other companies that offer offsetting for their events that they organize, and so this has become really something that I got interested in. It just takes quite some time, so there's always this lag. But I've been quite encouraged because since this paper came out, there's been a lot of people that talk to me about related ideas. A lot of PhD students that I've met are working on carbon offsetting now, on understanding drivers for willingness to pay for carbon mitigation. I think this is really a growing field, especially at this intersection of behavioral and environmental economics that I'm getting very excited about. And so we're going to do much more on this, but you probably have to wait another 5 years to get published.
I might contact you again when the working paper comes out. But maybe then just like takeaways are always a bit harder because in the paper you do say about the finding of 13 euro intrinsic value, that this finding suggests that voluntary climate protection initiatives may internalize only a small fraction of climate externalities, which has implications for environmental policy. What would kind of your takeaways be on that area?
Yeah, so I think there's two issues. One that I didn't really mention yet, but that we pay a lot of attention to in the paper is obviously we don't know ex ante how much people trust these offsets. So one reason why we observe a willingness to pay that is not terribly high is that people have a lot of distrust in this market, and a lot of distrust is justified because it is really a market with a lot of adverse selection. And we took a long time choosing an offset that was a very high quality one, but anyhow, you might have a lot of distrust, and we actually have some evidence in the paper that that is at least part of the story. Now, regarding the 13 euros estimates that we have, I do think that what it tells us is that given the current market environment, which may include a lot of distrust, a lot of adverse selection, this is what the private market can currently do in terms of mitigating the externality from consumption. And I think it tells us that this market can really only be a complement in a world with very imperfect environmental policy. Um, but it can certainly not be a substitute, and so we cannot think of this market as something that can replace important regulation. We really need environmental regulation, cap and trade, or carbon pricing to get us to what economists like to call the first best, right? So to internalize the externalities that come from emissions. And so I just think that quantifying people's willingness to pay in this market is informative because it quantifies the gap between what we think the social cost of carbon is and what people voluntarily are willing to pay.
Awesome. Actually, I think it was. I'm going to say it was really. I like that answer. I was like, oh, that's. Part of these conversations is like it's updating my own thinking. I really like that answer. So, because like you
Thanks.
say exactly, it's complementary. It's not a substitute. Um, I think that's a really good point, and exactly like the gap. And then also, that's a point I hadn't fully thought about either. Is there might be some distrust, like the true willingness to pay for a fully 100% certain offset might be higher, but then there's some probability that maybe it's not great. So
So maybe one thing that I should say is that the way we estimate the willingness to pay for carbon mitigation actually takes care of much of this distrust, because the way economists do this is that they would look at the impact elasticity and the price elasticity, and then broadly speaking, they would take a ratio of that, which would give you the willingness to pay, and the distrust would wash out of this estimation. That we show that in the paper. There's a long appendix on that if anyone feels unconvinced by this. But there is some to some extent the distrust here washes out in these estimates.
that
Yeah,
that's good. I didn't read the appendix, so I'm glad
you don't you
that
shouldn't.
but I trust the result.
Nobody will.
Even I, who really reads the paper, generally don't get to
Yes,
the appendix.
we say only referee two read the appendix,
Yeah,
and
exactly. So then, maybe then let me check. Is there anything we haven't talked about in your paper that you would like to highlight?
I think we covered the I think we covered all the important parts. Maybe one thing that I should really highlight is that this market is growing rapidly and it's becoming more and more important. And the finding that, at least without any additional learning and help, consumers seem to be fully unresponsive to how impactful these carbon offsets are, is quite concerning, because not only do we have adverse selection on the supply side, as you discussed in some of your other podcasts, but we also now find that on the demand side, consumers have a really hard time telling apart what a low impact offset from a high impact one. And so this is a concerning pattern, because it suggests that it gives even more incentives for firms to greenwash and to just offer something that looks good, but that doesn't really have much impact. And so I think we need to think hard about solutions to help consumers make better decisions.
Awesome. Then thank you so much, Matthias, for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.